I am not writing this to clear my conscience. I am writing because I still wake up at night with the feeling that something is pounding from the inside of my ribs, like it never stopped fighting. If you're reading this, you probably already know the name Marko Vukovic. In the MMA world, he became a myth before he became a champion. Commentators called him fearless, fans called him unstoppable, promoters called him a miracle. None of them were close enough. I was. I was his sparring partner. I stood in the same cage, and I know that something stayed inside after the bell rang. The gym where we trained didn't have a name, just an address people avoided remembering. It was an old industrial basement on the edge of the city, a place that smelled like mold, sweat, and iron. The walls were soaked with years of humidity, the floor layered with cracked mats that had absorbed too much blood to ever be clean again. People came there because they had nowhere else to go. I noticed Marko only because the head coach leaned toward me and whispered that I should skip full sparring that day. I asked why. He didn't answer directly, he just looked toward the far corner of the room. He's here. Marko was sitting against the wall, elbows resting on his knees, head slightly lowered. He wasn't stretching or shadow boxing. He wasn't watching anyone else train. He looked like a man waiting for a train that only he could hear. There was nothing flashy about him. Strong, yes, but not exaggerated. No tattoos screaming for attention, no nervous energy. His breathing was slow, controlled, almost unnaturally calm for a room full of aggression. He didn't look at anyone. Yet I had the strange sense that he knew exactly where everyone was. Marko didn't behave like a new fighter. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask questions. He didn't talk about records or dreams or belts. He showed up, changed clothes, sat down, and waited. When the coach finally called his name, he stood up without a word and walked into the cage. His first fight there should have been easy to read. His opponent was experienced, confident, loud, the kind of guy who feeds off noise and intimidation. He smiled as he entered the cage, bouncing on his feet, soaking in the attention. The bell rang. Marko didn't raise his guard. The first punch landed clean on his cheek. The second hit his ribs. The crowd reacted, some laughing, some surprised. Then I saw Marko's face. He didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He didn't look scared. He looked like someone who had just recognized an old memory. His eyes locked in, not on the man in front of him, but on something deeper, something only he could see. What followed wasn't a fight. It was precise, almost surgical. Every movement had intention. Every strike landed exactly where it needed to. The knockout wasn't explosive. It was final. Afterward, no one celebrated. The locker room was silent. The defeated fighter sat on the bench, shaking, staring at the floor like he was afraid it might open beneath him. Later, I heard him whisper that he didn't remember the moment he got hit. Only the feeling of being trapped somewhere he wanted desperately to escape. Marko sat across from me, wrapping his hands. I noticed a faint tremor in his fingers. I asked him if he was okay. He looked at me like he was surprised I could see him. "It's not over," he said. I asked what he meant. He looked down at his hands. The fight. As weeks passed, Marko kept winning. Easily, brutally. But unlike other fighters, success didn't inflate him. He didn't get louder or prouder. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. He started arriving before everyone else and leaving long after the gym emptied. Sometimes I found him standing barefoot in the center of the cage, eyes closed, breathing slowly. I asked him what he was doing. Listening, he said. I asked to what? The cage remembers. That was when I noticed the marks. Beneath layers of worn paint and rubber, the mat was scarred. Not from footwork or takedowns. These were deep, uneven scratches. They looked like fingernail marks. Before his first major tournament, officials required a psychological evaluation. Routine procedure, they said. Nothing to worry about. The psychologist spent almost 2 hours alone with Marco. When he came out, his face was pale, his hands unsteady. This man doesn't experience combat as a sport, he said quietly. For him, the cage is a boundary. A boundary for what? Someone asked. He hesitated before answering. For something that's being held inside. The night before the tournament, I went back to the gym to grab my gloves. Most of the lights were off. Only one flickered above the cage. I heard the sound before I saw him. Dull impacts, slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Marco was inside the cage. He was striking empty air. No bag, no opponent. Blood ran down his forehead. I shouted that no one was there. He turned toward me, breathing hard, eyes wide and unfocused. There is, he said. You just can't see it. Then he looked down at the mat. If I lose, he said, they come out. The next day he won the tournament. The crowd screamed. Cameras flashed. Headlines were written before he even left the cage. But as I stood there, I swear I felt movement beneath the mat. Something hit back. Like an answer. After the tournament, Marco stopped sleeping. At least that's what he told me. I didn't ask how he knew. His eyes answered before his mouth ever did. They had that hollow, glassy look people get when rest stops working. When sleep becomes just another place to fight. He began losing time. Entire hours would disappear. He'd arrive at the gym with fresh bruises he couldn't explain. Cuts along his forearms that looked too clean to be accidental. Once I noticed dried blood under his fingernails that didn't match any sparring session we'd had. When I asked him about it, he shrugged. It's quieter when I'm moving, he said. Marco never talked about his past. No hometown stories. No childhood memories. No explanation for how someone with his ability appeared fully formed, like a weapon pulled from the ground. That changed one night after training when the power went out. We were alone in the locker room, emergency lights flickering weakly. The gym was silent except for the hum of the backup generator. Marco sat on a bench staring at the floor like it was a mouth that might open if he looked away. You ever fight before this? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Yes, he said eventually, but not like this. He rolled up the sleeve of his hoodie. His arm was covered in scars. Not the random scars of street fights or bad training. These were deliberate, repeating patterns. Circular burns around the wrist. Thin parallel cuts along the bicep. Deep puncture scars near the shoulder joint. Perfectly spaced. They looked intentional. They taught us pain had weight, he said, that if you carried enough of it, something else wouldn't have to. I asked who taught him. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. People who didn't believe cages were enough. That was the first time he told me about the underground fights. They weren't illegal in the usual sense. No betting rings, no drunk crowds, no screaming announcers, just rooms, concrete rooms, circles drawn on the floor in chalk or blood. Men brought in from places no one would miss them. No rules, no time limits. The fights ended when someone couldn't stand or couldn't breathe or couldn't remember their own name. But that still wasn't the point. The fight wasn't to win, Marco said. It was to hold. I asked him to hold what? He tapped his chest. Pressure, he said. Fear. Everything people try to run from. He told me the fighters were chosen because they already had something broken inside them. Grief, rage, guilt. The kind of emotions that don't heal, just sink deeper. They were taught that pain could be used like a lid. And some of them were better at it than others. Marco was the best. They said I could take more than anyone, he said, that when I was bleeding, it stayed quiet. I asked him what happened to the others. He didn't answer. The next week, Marco had a televised fight. Big arena, bright lights, thousands of people screaming his name. The kind of environment that turns violence into entertainment and noise into protection. The fight started normally, too normally. His opponent was skilled, cautious, disciplined. The first round was slow, technical. Marco absorbed hits, gave few back. He looked bored. Then the second round started. Marco took a clean knee to the stomach, hard enough that the sound echoed. I saw his body tense, not in pain, but recognition. The crowd thought he was hurt. They cheered louder. Marco straightened. His posture changed. His shoulders dropped. His breathing slowed. His eyes unfocused, like he was looking through the man in front of him instead of at him. I felt it then. Not fear. Pressure. Like the air had thickened. The opponent backed away, suddenly unsure. He threw a jab that never landed. Marco moved through it like it wasn't there and grabbed him. The takedown was violent. The ground and pound that followed wasn't fast. It was deliberate, measured, almost patient. Between strikes, Marco leaned close. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw the opponent's face change. Panic replaced strategy. The referee ended the fight. The crowd roared. Later, the opponent told reporters he didn't remember most of the second round. He said the cage felt smaller. He said he felt like something was pressing down on him from the inside. That night, Marco vomited in the locker room. Not from exhaustion, from release. I almost dropped it, he whispered, hands shaking against the sink. Did you feel that? I nodded, even though I didn't fully understand. He looked at his reflection like it might blink back. The cage isn't strong like the old places, he said. It leaks. I asked him what would happen if it failed. He wiped his mouth and met my eyes. Then it won't be just me fighting anymore. A few days later, maintenance staff found new damage to the mat. Deep impressions, as if something heavy had been pressed upward for a long time, trying to remember the shape of the world above it. The first man who fought Marco after the tournament didn't retire. He vanished. No announcement. No press release. No injury report. His social media went silent within a week. Friends said he stopped answering calls. His gym said he came in once after the fight, sat in the corner for 3 hours, and left without training. They said he kept touching his chest, like something was pushing back. After that, the pattern started. Fighters who faced Marco changed. Some became reckless, throwing themselves into wars they couldn't win. Others refused to enter the cage again, claiming claustrophobia, panic attacks, or sudden insomnia. A few quit MMA entirely and moved away, unable to explain why they couldn't stand in closed spaces anymore. One of them called me late at night, drunk and crying. He showed me something, he kept saying. He didn't mean to. It just looked through him. I asked what he saw. He hung up. Marco noticed it too. He started watching his opponents instead of studying film. He'd sit backstage, head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, like he was listening for something behind the noise of the arena. "They're already cracked," he said once. "I just widen it." The camera started catching things no one could explain. In one fight, slow motion replay showed Marco's shadow moving a fraction of a second before he did. Editors blamed frame rate issues. In another, the audio picked up a low sound during a clinch. Too deep to be a voice, too rhythmic to be crowd noise. Fans online argued. Skeptics laughed. Conspiracy forums filled with speculation. Marco avoided all of it. He began wearing long sleeves, even during weigh-ins. I asked him why. "It marks the exit points," he said. He didn't elaborate. The dreams started around then. I began having them first. I'd be standing in the cage alone, lights off, the mat cold under my feet. I could hear breathing beneath me. Slow, massive, patient. I'd wake up soaked in sweat, certain something had shifted while I slept. Marco said he didn't dream anymore. "It watches when I close my eyes," he said. "Dreaming gives it space." Before his next major fight, a medical scan revealed something strange. His rib cage showed stress fractures, but not from impact, from pressure pushing outward. The doctors wanted him to pull out. The commission hesitated. The promoters pushed forward. Money has a way of dulling instincts. The fight sold out. The arena was packed. Lights blinding, music thunderous. The cage door closed. From the first exchange, something was wrong. Marco's opponent was aggressive, but his strikes kept hesitating mid-motion, like his body didn't trust itself. His eyes darted around, tracking something no one else could see. Marco barely moved. He absorbed the blows, each one drawing blood, each one pulling something tighter beneath his skin. His breathing deepened. The mat creaked beneath his feet. Then the opponent screamed, not from pain, from realization. He backed into the fence, hands raised, shouting that the cage was bending. The crowd booed, thinking it was theatrics. Marco stepped forward. For the first time, he looked afraid. "Stop," he whispered. The opponent collapsed. The referee ended the fight, but the pressure didn't stop. Cameras caught the mat lifting slightly at the center of the cage, less than an inch, just enough to warp the lines, enough to be noticed. The broadcast cut away. Backstage, Marco collapsed. His body convulsed, muscles locking, teeth chattering violently. I held him down as medics rushed in. He grabbed my arm with inhuman strength. "It knows the shape now," he gasped. "It remembers the lights." I asked him what he meant. He squeezed harder. "It wants witnesses." That night, footage leaked online. Just a few frames. Enough to show something beneath the mat pressing upward. Enough to show a shadow that didn't belong to anyone standing. The league denied it. The videos disappeared, but people had already seen enough. Marco was scheduled for a title fight. The biggest cage, the brightest lights, the strongest boundary left. He stopped training. Instead, he sat in the empty gym, hands pressed flat against the mat, whispering to something only he could hear. I asked him if he thought he could still hold it. He looked up at me, eyes bloodshot, voice barely steady. "I don't think it wants me to." The promoters didn't want to hear about pressure or boundaries. They wanted numbers. The leaked footage had done the opposite of damage. Ticket sales spiked overnight. Social media buzzed with slowed clips, zoomed frames, theories layered on theories. The league called it controversy. The sponsors called it opportunity. Marco was called into a private meeting 2 weeks before the title fight. No cameras, no contracts on the table, just men in suits who smelled like money and stress. They told him the cage had been reinforced. Thicker mat, stronger frame, a Additional supports beneath the platform. They spoke like engineers solving a mechanical issue. Marco listened quietly. Then he asked a question that made the room go silent. Did you reinforce the space between the lights? No one answered. After the meeting, Marco didn't go home. He went back to the gym. He asked me to lock the door. What he showed me that night wasn't a confession. It was a procedure. He peeled back the long sleeves he'd been wearing for months. Beneath them, the scars had changed. Some were reopened. Others had faded into something that looked less like healed skin and more like seams. He laid down in the center of the cage and told me to watch the mat. As he slowed his breathing, the air thickened again. The same pressure I'd felt during his fights crept across my skin. The mat beneath him flexed slightly, like it was responding to weight that wasn't there. They didn't just teach us to fight, he said calmly. They taught us how to pull it back. He explained that the underground circles weren't about violence. Violence was just the tool. The real goal was containment. Pain focused the mind. Fear narrowed attention. Together they formed a kind of anchor, a ritual disguised as brutality. But the old places had rules. No crowds, no witnesses, no lights. Every cheer, every camera, every scream made it harder to hold. Marco had been bleeding containment into spectacle, and now it wanted more. He asked me to help him recreate the old conditions. We shut off the lights. No music, no noise. Just the emergency glow in our breathing. Marco knelt in the center of the cage and pressed his forehead to the mat. He whispered words I didn't recognize, syllables that didn't belong to any language I knew. The mat trembled beneath him, not violently, but insistently. Something responded. I felt it in my teeth, in my chest. In the instinct screaming to leave, Marco screamed, not in pain, in effort. The pressure peaked, then eased. When he lifted his head, blood ran from his nose, ears, eyes, but he was smiling. It remembers, he said. I reminded it who holds the line. For a moment, I believed him. The week before the title fight, the atmosphere shifted. Fighters backstage refused to warm up in the same area as Marco. Equipment malfunctioned around him. Cameras flickered when he passed. One production assistant fainted after brushing against his shoulder. Marco grew thinner. His voice roughened. His movements slowed, like gravity had increased just for him. The night of the fight arrived. The biggest arena of his career. The cage looked different, or heavier, lower, as if something beneath it had already settled in. When Marco stepped inside, the noise hit him like a wave. The crowd roared his name, phones flashed like stars, the lights burned overhead. I saw his jaw tighten. The bell rang. From the first exchange, the pressure surged. Marco's opponent moved confidently, landing strikes, feeding the crowd. Every hit drew blood. Every cheer fed the space inside Marco's chest. The mat groaned. Marco staggered back, clutching the fence. His breathing became erratic. His eyes darted upward toward the lights. I knew then, this wasn't about winning anymore. This was about surviving the release. Midway through the round, the mat buckled. Not visibly. Not enough for the audience to react. But enough for Marco to feel it. He dropped to one knee. The crowd thought it was damage. They cheered louder. Marco looked straight at me through the fence. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked terrified. It's not enough, he mouthed. Then he stood and let go. When Marco stood back up, the cage went silent. Not instantly, not completely. The crowd was still screaming, but the sound no longer reached the center of the arena. It felt muffled, distant, like we were all underwater. The lights above flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting long, distorted shadows across the mat. Marco no longer held a guard. His arms hung loose at his sides. His chest rose and fell too slowly, too deeply, like something else was borrowing his lungs. Blood ran freely down his torso, but he didn't acknowledge it. His opponent hesitated. That hesitation saved his life. Marco didn't rush him. He didn't chase. He took one step forward, and the mat answered with a low, grinding sound. The cage frame vibrated. Screws rattled. The fence bowed inward as if pulled by pressure from the center. The opponent backed away, hands raised, eyes wide. "I don't want this," he said, and the microphone caught it. Marco opened his mouth. The voice that came out was not entirely his. "You already stepped inside." The mat split. Not violently, not explosively. It peeled apart like something unsealing a wound that had never healed correctly. The center of the cage sagged inward, revealing darkness beneath. Not empty darkness, dense darkness, moving darkness, the kind that suggests depth without revealing shape. The audience finally fell silent. Cameras kept rolling. Something pushed upward. Marco screamed. Not in pain, but in resistance. His muscles locked, veins standing out like cables under his skin. The scars along his arms tore open, glowing faintly as if heat radiated from inside him. He dropped to both knees, hands pressed flat against the mat, holding it down. The thing beneath him pushed back. The cage lights shattered one by one. In the half-darkness I saw it, not fully, not clearly, a suggestion of form, too wide, too tall, pressing upward through Marco's silhouette like a shadow trying to escape its source. The opponent ran, the referee ran, people screamed, but the cage door did not open. Marco's voice cut through the chaos. "Look at it," he shouted. "It needs to be seen." The pressure spiked. The mat ruptured completely. The thing rose just enough for the crowd to understand that it was not a metaphor, that it had mass, that it had learned balance. Marco arched backward, his spine bending in ways a body shouldn't. His mouth opened impossibly wide as something breathed through him. The sound was low and vast, like air moving through a cavern. Then, suddenly, Marco slammed his forehead into the mat. Once, twice, on the third impact, the scars along his body flared bright, then collapsed inward. The pressure reversed. The thing beneath screamed. Not in sound, but in sensation, a vibration that rattled teeth and bones. Marco screamed with it. He forced his hands deeper into the torn mat, pushing the thing back down, folding himself around it like a lid snapping shut. The cage collapsed inward. The broadcast cut to black. When the lights came back on, the cage was destroyed. The mat was torn and scorched. The fence lay twisted like broken ribs. Marco lay in the center, alone, breathing, barely. There was no sign of the thing. Officials called it a structural failure, electrical malfunction, mass hysteria. The footage vanished within hours. Marco never fought again. He didn't die. That was the worst part. He survived. But whatever he had been holding, it no longer needed him. I visit the gym sometimes. The cage is gone, the floor replaced, the walls repainted. But if you stand in the center late at night, when the lights are off and the city is quiet, you can still feel it, the pressure, waiting. Because it learned something that night. It learned what cheers sound like. It learned what witnesses are. And it learned that if one cage failed, others might open easier. I don't spar anymore. I don't watch fights. And I never stand in the center of a room without checking the floor beneath my feet. Because some boundaries don't break. They get remembered. And once something remembers the shape of the world above it, it doesn't forget how to push.